things or
Sorry, I forgot to start recording.
yeah, so
Yeah.
that's the way you describe that. It's not just for us, but also our clients are doing that too. They haven't been validated. And over time, as you suffer and you don't get any validation from family or society, it's just you start to kind of give up. You start to feel like, you know what, maybe I need to just move on and put it to the side.
Yeah,
So,
and I appreciate that, because the connection to what we do is, if we have that tendency to not validate ourselves, if we have a client that's not validating their own experience, you run the risk of leaning right into that, of saying, okay, like, I hear you. Yep, you're in control of this. You know, you've done this thing to cope, and like 2 thumbs up here. So you just run the risk of potentially encouraging behavior that won't in the long term be helpful. So of course we know about self-protection, self-preservation in the short term can be incredibly adaptive. Applied long term, those can be things that become quite corrosive to an individual. So I super appreciate that, Danny, of you have to recognize the tendencies within yourself, because we can inadvertently introduce those coping mechanisms or those thought processes into the session, and then not really allow for that client to feel, to disclose, to kind of try different ways because of the ways in which we've coped with our own traumas.
Yeah, as Danny was talking, I was totally agreeing with what he was saying about, tending to not validate my own experience or these negative feelings that I have. And I kind of had was thinking about, like, where does that come from? Why do I do that? And it's not something that I wrote about in my paper, because I was just thinking about it now. But I remember being a kid and saying something like, I'm sad or I'm angry. And my parents' reaction was often like, well, there's kids way worse off than you.
Sure.
And I think it's really easy to make comparisons. And I think that's kind of what we've been talking about, with this ACE score. And it's really easy to compare our lived experience with someone else. Sorry. And well, mine's not as bad as someone else, therefore mine can't be that bad.
Yeah.
And it's really easy to invalidate that experience, because I'm assuming the majority of us here are empathetic and compassionate and in some way altruistic. And I think that also leads to invalidating our own experience, because we sometimes care more about others and what they're experiencing.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Miles. I think that you're identifying a tendency of individuals kind of in our field. And I'm labeling this in a way that makes sense to me. So please feel free to disregard this label because it applies to me. And it was something that I resonated with a lot of your reflections, was kind of this codependent tendency in relations, where I think we think a lot about it with addiction, right? But there's relational codependency. And again, if this label isn't helpful for you, take it away. It's been helpful to me in recognizing what I do in putting other people's needs and desires ahead of our own, and having that be one of the things that we really get from being in this field of all day. I get to give, and I get the payback I get from this is seeing progress. And at the end of the day, it's a really easy way to like never attend to our own stuff. So I think what you're talking about here, Miles, is something that is pretty common amongst individuals who enter into the helping field, and something for us to stay aware of. And because many of us were brought here for lived experiences, right? Many of the reasons that we come to this field is family of origin experiences of, I would have liked somebody to have provided this for me. So you know what, I'm going to be that person, and I'm going to attend to little Sarah, I'm going to attend to younger Sarah and help. And by helping heal another person, maybe I'll get some vicarious healing. And I think that that's one of the reasons why, or that's one thing that I don't think that we lean into enough in terms of our motivation for being in this field, is it's okay to get something out of what we do. I think the narrative a lot of the time is this very like selfless, I do this because I'm wholly altruistic. There's nothing that I get out of this. But I really disagree with that in that I think we do get something out of what we do. And the more that we can just like lean into it and say, hey, I get something out of helping people. And it's not just like the joy of helping, like there's some healing that's happening with me as well. One of my most influential mentors, sorry if let me know if I already shared this with you. I feel like I talk about this mentor all the time because he's awesome. So he is from Oaxaca, Mexico, and his family immigrated to Michigan, where he had a difficult experience there being anyway, it's not relevant necessarily, but one of the pieces of research that he does is working with families where there are parents who are like at risk of abusing or neglecting their children. And he was both abused and neglected by his father in particular. His mother was a little like, she didn't intervene. So there was some resentment toward her with that of, why didn't you protect me? But he does this work with families from Mexico, and he's very overt. I don't know if he's very overt with the participants in his studies, but he's very overt with his trainees and other people professionally of like, I do this to help younger me. And it's not just to help these families, it's really to feel like there's some kind of corrective experience for me of letting go of some of the resentment, letting go of these very difficult, heavy feelings that I've been carrying for a long time. So it's okay to get stuff like that out of what we do.
I have a question.
Sure.
So based off of what you were speaking about, like our clients' experience, oftentimes, we can inadvertently lean into like what they already feel isn't traumatic because we do the same thing.
Sure.
Do you feel like if there's like cases where, okay, let's say like teens, right? And they're in this space of, like they kind of have like it is what it is type of mentality because, they've learned that their parents, that maybe their parental dynamics aren't going to change and they have to just like live with whatever it is and nothing is going to change. Like, do you see that as like being a sign of like protecting oneself from like certain experiences that have happened in the past that now they just automatically are like, nothing's going to change and I just have to accept it?
Yeah, I mean, do I see that as protective in a way? Absolutely. Do I see that as inherently maladaptive? I don't. Because I'm also thinking of like micro and macro level stuff. One of the things that we hopefully provide our clients is a different experience, right? So they're in our space where like lived experiences, these macro level, societal messages, they live there. They don't necessarily permeate all of the work. And what I mean by that is let's say that you're working with a teen boy who comes from an environment and has all of these, societal messages of you need to be tough, you don't emote, that's for weak people, you need to be a man, like whatever the messaging is. In your space, those things they don't really apply. in the micro space that you're providing this individual. One thing to keep in mind is when you're encouraging emotion, when you're encouraging expression, recognizing the environment that this person's going back into. So if you're saying you need to express yourself, you need to emote, you need to share these things, that's what's going to be helpful to you. And you don't take into consideration the environment that they're going back into when they start to express, they could be so shamed, so stigmatized that they actually go the other way and say, screw all this, I'm never talking to anybody ever again. Because all that happened was now my friends are making fun of me. Now I have a reputation at school. Now my family thinks I'm whatever. So I share with you the importance of understanding those things environmentally while still creating that space for a client. So you don't want to say, well, yep, you're going into an environment that doesn't promote this, doesn't encourage this. So you know what, you're right. It is what it is. Is that mindset relevant? Absolutely. Is it potentially long-term going to be something that closes them off to relationships, that doesn't allow them to connect with others meaningfully and transparently? Of course. Is there a way to balance the two? I believe so. Of this recognition of the environment while also saying in this space, this is something that you can do in here. I also recognize the risk in doing that out there. Let's talk about that. I'm aware of these different spaces that you occupy and the different levels of transparency that you're able to have in these spaces. So what, like, you know, kind of brainstorming with this individual, how do you balance these two? How do you navigate these two while self-preserving, but also while connecting with others, especially if that's something that this individual has alluded to, which largely we're social beings. We don't want to live in this space of, I can't trust anybody. I'm never going to share anything with anybody. Nobody thrives in that. So just noticing and recognizing those macro level things, that's a part of that cultural awareness and that cultural humility that we lean into so much and we have to be aware of. Does that answer your question, Summer?
Yes, definitely. Thank you.
Of course. Anything else? Any other questions, comments about anything that we've talked about so far? All right, are you guys ready to listen to me talking a whole lot? So like I said, we have quite a bit to get through. I do not have any built-in like conversations or anything, so we're gonna be plugging through. So just please stay vocal with me since I won't be able to see any of you. So we're gonna go back to what we talked about or what we started last week and finish with the section on captivity. So this was definitely a part of the reading that I recognized really affected many of you in reading this. So please engage with me if you feel so apt to do so. Okay, so going back to last week's reading, so we talked about these institutions that are very protective of perpetrators and, you know, really not supportive of survivors, victims. Again, the language around that is really, you're going to meet your client in terms of what they relate to and how they want to talk about themselves and label themselves, which may be neither. So just being aware of that we oscillate between victim and survivor in literature, but in terms of clinical application, neither of those may be applicable. So you're just going to use the language that the client uses. So captivity, very different from what we're talking about this coming week, where we talked about these acute traumas, mostly pretty synonymous with crisis. So captivity is long-term exposure to really a lack of agency. So in this chapter, they talked about the methods of establishing control that are very systematic and repetitive. So there is a systematic approach to essentially like disarming, dehumanizing, incapacitating an individual to be very submissive in this. So the techniques are disempowerment and disconnection. So these are going to be themes if you're working with an individual who has had an experience of some level of captivity, that you're going to really be leaning into the themes of disempowerment and disconnection. So how an individual overpowers somebody who is in captivity is the technique of fear. And fear is imposed or evoked in this with inconsistent and unpredictable outbursts of violence. And then these seemingly random enforcement of petty rules. So there's no predictability. So you're really trying to disarm a person. And I say disarm potentially in error, but you're really like, I think what I'm trying to say is like breaking down an individual, because humans like predictability, right? We like consistency. So if I'm going to have power over you, I'm going to disconnect you from any, kind of semblance of relationships that you had, semblances of identity. And I'm also going to be incredibly inconsistent in the way that I interact with you and enforce rules. So your equilibrium is constantly off. So not only is the perpetrator inducing fear, they want to do everything that they can to create no autonomy with the individual. So I'm talking about things like disempowerment, disconnection, and autonomy, because these are, so empowerment, connection, autonomy, these are things that you're going to work on creating and enhancing, reestablishing with your client. And then, so not only is there, random enforcement of petty rules, there's also really potential or seemingly random or intermittent rewards. So this, kind of on this basic level of what's the punishment and rewards? What is that theory? What is that called?
Operational?
Yes, thank you. So, using these more basic techniques. And so what the perpetrator is trying to do is making the, person in captivity, prisoner, however person that is imprisoned, completely reliant on the perpetrator. And then so remember, captivity isn't always like, the Criminal Minds type where they're like in a basement, in a cage, it's not this literal captivity. You can be captive in your own home. So these are instances of intimate partner violence, of domestic violence. So I say that because the next slide is going to hopefully outline for you something that is really important in the assessment phase. But so what happens in like the cycle of violence is that the perpetrator or the abuser, batterer, however, whatever makes most sense for you, is where this person becomes incredibly apologetic and incredibly remorseful. And then the power imbalance is changed. So then the person who has been being abused, the person that has had no autonomy, no agency, is now given very temporarily this power to have any agency at all and potentially steer the relationship in some way. But that's considered the honeymoon phase or the remorseful phase of the cycle. And then it just starts again. So I wanted to highlight here. So this is potentially part of the reason why individuals stay in relationships where, but when it's good, it's so good. They're so sweet. I know they're sorry for what they do. And they promise me they'll change. And I'm going to really lean in to that promise, and I believe in them. So in these latter points here, the intensity of the possession, the possessive attention doesn't change, but the quality is dramatically transformed. So they're still possessive, they are still controlling, but it looks different, it feels different, so it may not be as detectable. And then reconciliation is a critical step, or a crucial step in breaking down the psychological resistance of the partner. So here I want to highlight, so these are just basically 3 different, I hope you can see these, but if you can't, you can, this is on Canvas. So these are essentially 3 different conceptualizations of really the same thing. So here you can see like there's tension building and all of these kind of coping or things that may be visible in terms of behavior, or potentially cognitive approaches to the tension building. And then there's generally an explosion. This could be something where an object is thrown, a person is hit, and then the person, oops, sorry, I'm losing my cursor. So there's the explosion. So these are things where the person might verbally humiliate the individual in some kind of public place. It could be private. It likely wouldn't be super public because the perpetrator is usually, they show themselves in a very different way publicly than they do privately. So many of this stuff happens with really only the survivor or the victim. And then, so these are all ways that the response can be from the victim. So then this explosion happens, and then there's this place of what's considered either the honeymoon or, again, the like reconciliation, where there's a lot of remorse that's shown. And so the person may apologize, justify their behavior in some way. They may purchase things because one of the things with a perpetrator or a person an abuser, is that they pay attention. So if their partner shares that they're like interested in something, they'll make note of that because it's something that they can use not selflessly for their partner, but to their advantage. So the victim might say something along the way of like, wow, like in passing of really liking a shirt or a piece of jewelry in this honeymoon stage or in this reconciliation stage. This is where the perpetrator would present their partner with that and being like, see how thoughtful I am, see how great I am, stay with me. And then ultimately what happens is the cycle happens again. And usually what happens in terms of cycles, and so all of this is at the center of this is a denial of its existence, of the cycle's existence. So the cycle changes in frequency and in frequency. So usually the cycle starts slow. So it may take a whole year for this cycle to happen. And then, as abuse has continued to happen, this cycle may happen once a week, once every few days, once a day. So just to be aware of that, just because there's been a seemingly like long period, and I do that because it's arbitrary, between tension building and the explosion and the honeymoon, doesn't mean that this doesn't exist. So again, I just wanted to provide you with a lot of information of ways to think about this and to understand this. And then you can see that these are like 3 stages here. And then this one has 4. So again, the tension building. And one of the things that you may find with some of your clients who have been like the recipient of domestic violence or intimate partner violence is they are acutely aware of when tension is building. So they may invoke the violence just to get it over with because they know it's inevitable. So now I'm just sitting in this space of tension. So you know what? I'm just going to do something that I know is going to upset my partner to get this over with so we can get to that reconciliation phase or we can get to that honeymoon phase. So I just say that in understanding some of the like psychology and that those interpersonal and intrapersonal dynamics that can be existing when the cycle of abuse is existing in a relationship. So here's another, so this is the Duluth Power and Control Wheel. Just so you know that it exists, there is the equity wheel. So basically, if you look at this kind of as like a spoke or like a bicycle tire, if you look at all of these in between the spokes, the equity wheel has basically the antidote to each piece of this. So I'm trying to think of like, using economic abuse. The antidote to this would be like economic equity. So like each person has the ability to like have their own money or to make financial decisions. They have access to their money. So that would be something that would be existing in a, what would be considered an equitable or a healthy relationship. These are all characteristics of an abusive or unhealthy relationship. So you don't have to have all 8. You can have 1 or 2, but sometimes this can be helpful in, so that psychoeducation piece that many of the approaches discuss is bringing this out and saying, does any of this exist in your relationship? And just allowing that person to just see this. And it may take a long time for that individual to come to terms with, or they may never. So this is another thing to just keep in mind in terms of patience and grace and understanding of, you know, why people make decisions that they make or feel that they don't have a decision to make, is that this could potentially be helpful in just showing an individual potential characteristics that are in their relationship, and then really giving them the choice to do what they want with it. You'll want to be careful if you ever give like a handout going home with somebody, because if their partner who is abusive may find this is incredibly threatening, because you could also potentially out them for being in therapy, which abusers absolutely don't want their partners to be in. They don't want any outside influence, and you could potentially inadvertently create tension and create some violence. So just being very aware of how you're giving the information. And again, being very, giving the client as much agency and allowing for them to have consent. Because many times in these abusive relationships, they don't have the ability to consent to anything. They're not given like the chance to consent. So in this, just saying like, would you like to take this home? Is there like a place that you could put this that it would not create any sort of violence for you or you know, problem for you. So just being very aware of the space that you create for the individual and how different it can be outside of your therapy room. So I just alluded to this, but the hope of the perpetrator is that the individual that they are keeping in captivity has no connection with other people, because connection to other people or influence of other people will largely probably undermine and contradict what they are doing, because what they are doing is not good. So they want to make sure that the person that they're keeping captive has as little influence from others as possible, because then that allows for them to have all the influence and then really try to call the shots. So isolating the individual is the perpetrators look to do this because they don't want the individual to have any information, any sort of aid, any sort of emotional support, because they want the perpetrator to provide all of that. So one of the other things that, because this could be something that potentially you could help brainstorm or talk about with your clients, is the idea of a transitional object. So it's essentially something that like brings them back to their identity or potentially their time prior to imprisonment or captivity, because it's an ability to have a connection to an attachment with other people, with identity and maintaining some level of humanity within them. So this could be something that you work with clients who have come out of that, because or if they're still in it, of this potential transitional object that connects them to a piece of their identity that keeps them hopeful or keeps them connected to others or themselves. So when an individual is in some level of in captivity, we still want social connection. We all humans want social connection. So if they are kept in isolation, really the opportunity they have to connect with somebody is with the perpetrator. So this, again, when you think of this systematic way in which perpetrators work, this is by design. And so the individual can become incredibly dependent upon and potentially protective over the perpetrator. So some of the things that you will potentially be exposed to, or some coping that you will see with individuals who have had some sort of chronic trauma, is avoidance and constriction. So avoidance really is, avoiding talking about, avoid thinking about, doing whatever that the individual can to avoid being in that emotional space or in that cognitive space of chronic trauma. So again, I just want to highlight, what we ask our clients to do can feel incredibly counterproductive, and resistance or hesitance to do that should be expected. So you're telling me that the thing that I experienced for years, that I have worked so hard to compartmentalize, to push away, in the best way that I know how, you're asking me to look right at it and potentially re-experience it? No thanks. So just know that there has to be some psychoeducation. There has to be a conversation around the reason that you want to do this, or that you think it will be helpful, and why you believe it will be helpful. So the other response to chronic trauma is constriction. So this is essentially an individual not learning to not feel, to not have an emotional response to experiences. So in chronic trauma, if I am continually emotionally activated, emotionally triggered by something, I'm seemingly inflicting pain upon myself. So how am I going to fix this or move away from it? I'm going to basically deprogram myself from experiencing this emotionally. And then what happens consequently is the entire range of emotional expression, emotional experience is constricted. So not only does the person constrict their feelings of negative affect or negative emotion, they also constrict positive. So the goal is no emotion, or the consequence is no emotion. So constriction is adaptive while the person is in captivity. Like I said, it leads to an atrophy of basically all emotional capacity. And then there is this overdevelopment of the constriction in a solitary life. So in their inner experience is constricted. So again, there's no emotional response to anything, which is more protective than having even positive emotional responses. Okay, so then there's also how avoidance and constriction can manifest is also through dissociation. So this is completely trying to separate from the experience. So they're suppressing their emotions, they're minimizing what has happened, and there can sometimes be complete denial of what they experienced in terms of like not only what was like inflicted upon them, but sometimes what individuals like have to do to survive captivity. So maybe they did something that was, you know, against their personal moral code or something just for the sake of survival. And then once an individual is out of captivity, that might be a piece of their history that they can't bear to go back to. They can't bear to acknowledge or accept that that is something that I did. So if this piece of their history is pushed away and denied, that's creating what we consider a fragmented identity. So one of the things that in trauma work that we do is what's considered integration. So this timeline that this person has experienced, you know, of their entire lived experience, you can't cut out the piece of captivity. You can't cut out that and still have an integrated identity. So the goal is to be able to acknowledge that piece of their lived experience while also trying to eliminate and or at least decrease the feelings of shame and guilt and all of that negative the negative emotion that comes with thinking about what they essentially had to do to survive. So if they continue to deny it, because again, it feels like it would work, but essentially it's counterproductive. Is the more that you deny, the more that you turn away and avoid an experience, the more it lives and the more it festers. And sometimes, so if I'm imagining like let's say the trauma is this big, the more I turn away from it, the more my anxiety about it grows, and the more the experience becomes overwhelming. So if I were to look at it and say, oh, it's that big, okay, maybe I can cope with this. But the longer you look away, your imagination can get kind of big with it, and the experience can become bigger and heavier and more impactful than it like actually was if you were able to look at it. So I do this because it's a narrative technique of externalization or externalizing, where you're taking up this piece and being able to look at it and analyze it and have some power and agency over it. Whereas if you look away from it, it can become very close to you and very big. I hope that makes sense. Is that like confusing or not clear to anybody?
No, but I have a question.
Sure.
Well, kind of two questions. One, with what you were just saying, is there like situations where the trauma can almost become like there's so much denial and it becomes so big that like you're not even aware that it's that situation? Did I freeze?
Yeah, you did. Can you start at the top again, Paige? Well, the last thing I heard was that there's so much denial, it becomes so big, and then we lost you after that.
Okay. That it's almost hard to like pinpoint it back to that situation, and it just becomes like these maladaptive behaviors or like pains that you have in your day-to-day life that you can't even like link back to a trauma per se, or like you're unsure.
Of course. And how we would like facilitate kind of an unpacking of that would be starting where the client can start. So over time, so if I kind of liken it to, you know, if you have like a super messy room that you want to organize, if you take in the entire room, you're like, where am I going to start? Oh my gosh, I'm so overwhelmed. But if you kind of look at it as one box or one item at a time, or like a section or something like that, it can become a little bit more digestible and feel a little bit more doable. So unpacking trauma is, and I don't mean to like trivialize this and say like, it's just like organizing a room. I just tried to like, hopefully have something that's a little bit relatable, in that you start where the client is able to and where they feel comfortable. And then what can happen over time is becoming accustomed to the process of doing that allows more linking to particular experiences, because they're becoming more in touch with their emotions and what has happened. And so they're kind of familiarizing themselves with the process to have the capacity and the tools to make those links, which may take a very long time. Does that answer your question, Paige?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, so you're starting with where they're at, what they're able to identify, and it may be very small. Start there. And I say that relative. I know that very small is very subjective. But then what you're doing is building tools along the way to essentially kind of scaffold to some of those things that may, 6 months ago felt impossible to do. And now, they're able to do that with your help and with your guidance and with the tools that they've learned. Okay, let's go ahead and take a break. We will come back together at 11:15. Come back. Now I just have to figure out what I did with my PowerPoint. Oh boy. Almost done here. Okay, so just a couple more slides left of last week's PowerPoint. So again, please feel free to jump in here, ask questions, respond to anything. So again, speaking of chronic trauma, so reiterating the response of constriction being very habitual, and again, adaptive. So the tendency or the response of emotional constriction is something that once an individual is out of captivity to be unlearned. So it is something that like and also just being aware as clinicians, the introducing of an emotional experience and the encouraging of the emotional like kind of spectrum continuum can be incredibly overwhelming and very, very scary. Because again, I would rather feel nothing than feel emotions. I would rather not feel happy emotions than to have the possibility of feeling bad emotions or hurtful, scary, negative emotions. So that's kind of that can be part of the thought process. I don't want to, generalize that. So the other thing to really keep in mind as clinicians is this mistakenly applied concept of learned helplessness. And the thought that, okay, this individual must have given up. They must have, like this, something must have become, must have become passive in some way. And so expanding your understanding or at the very least giving yourself the opportunity to look at this in alternative ways, because there could be an element of learned helplessness. But what theorists, what has happened is that the idea of learned helplessness, or the application of learned helplessness, is applied everywhere, and that very well may not be the case. So that second power or bullet point here of learning of the individual, in captivity, learning that every action is going to be watched, and that most actions will be thwarted, and that they'll have to pay dearly for any sort of perceived failure from their abuser, from their captor. So it's this becoming as small as possible to not trigger, or not create something within or seemingly like they're creating something within the abuser for them to have to pay for. So it's not giving up, it's the recognition that everything I do is being monitored, and likely whatever I do will lead to me being punished in some way. So then there's the concept of traumatic bonding. So when an individual is experiencing chronic trauma in captivity, that the opportunity to bond with others is not there. So they, in order to survive, so again, being social, humans, we want connection and bonding with other humans. If my only option is to bond with my captor, I'm gonna have to do that to survive. So what can happen here with traumatic bonding? So again, it's something to keep in mind as you're assessing, as you're talking to your clients, your patients, whatever setting that you're in. So with traumatic bonding, you can come to see individuals can come to see their captors as saviors, and fear or not like, or potentially hate rescuers. So there's this psychological infantilism that compels victims to cling to the very person that's potentially endangering their life. So it's this very difficult experience of recognizing that this person can hurt you, and you also have very strong, potentially positive feelings for this individual. So the survivor in this experience can oscillate between this feeling of intense attachment to their abuser, to their captor, and then being absolutely terrified and withdraw. So they're learning the very extremes of a relationship, and there's really no middle in that. I'm either withdrawn and terrified, or I'm either feeling incredibly attached. So what can happen is this can create some alterations in the individual, in the victims, or the person's identity, the person in captivity. So they, again, like I was talking about before, there may be some things that happened while they were in captivity that they engaged in, or that they reflect on and think. So for example, there can be a lot of shame in individuals who have stayed in abusive relationships. So again, because the narrative can be, or the response to this is, well, just leave. Why didn't you just leave? And as we know, it's much more complicated than that. And not only with resources, with macro level stuff, with micro level stuff, with that intrapersonal. So again, you have to keep in mind the systematic way in which people are held captive. It doesn't even necessarily have to be something that a person, so let's say, for example, somebody while they were in captivity harmed another person. Like, it can be something kind of more tangible or action, I guess, oriented. It can also be the shame about staying. Why did I put my children through this? Why didn't I feel like I deserved something more than that? So there's this almost a gaslighting of themselves in this. So again, thinking of the time in captivity as something that is a part of this person's history, and denying or turning away from that doesn't help long-term in coping with that. And what can happen also in captivity is I can't take out any sort of rage or anger on my captor, but I have it. So what do I do with it? And this is where self-inflicted harm can happen. And it doesn't have to be in the form of like, cutting or something like that. It can just be in terms of being like very emotionally destructive to oneself. But it's essentially just like carrying out what the captor is doing, what the abuser is doing onto themselves. So these are just, I share all of this for, again, creating space and allowing for all of these experiences to come out, while also recognizing how potentially like laden in shame and how deeply the person sitting across from you may be self-loathing, and not trying to like have them escape from that, meaning like, this isn't something you should feel shame about. This isn't something like, I see that you're self-loathing. Don't do that. Like you don't want to expedite the process in that, of just really allowing for that to come out, because like really no amount of you saying don't feel shame about that, or you shouldn't feel shame about this, or it wasn't your fault, necessarily will translate until the person really believes it themselves. So I'm not saying don't say those things, but I also am not saying say those things in an attempt to like convince that person. So just being patient with the process largely is what I'm saying. So last thing, I think I pulled this from Pinterest or something like that. But I thought that it did a good job of kind of, again, this is one experience of traumatic bonding, and it also very clearly says that it's simplified. So please don't take this as like the formula, or, please recognize that there's nuances in this. But this is more of a traumatic bonding from childhood. So essentially taking a client or patient, participant, again, whatever setting you're in, understanding love and connection from their family of origin. So, for those of you who are really into attachment style and connection and that kind of stuff, what we have learned is what you learn in terms of connection and love in your family of origin really does inform your relationships later in life. Is the way that you attached or the way that you bonded with your caregivers or your attachment figures, does that like label you forever? No. Does it absolutely inform the way that you move forward in relationships? Yes. So this is just one where it's basically saying, this child learns about abuse and rejection and love, and then they associate that with, they associate love with abuse, and then they learn to shut down. They blame themselves for what happens. They internalize this as love hurts and it's hard. And then potentially what they do is like accept this or think of this as the norm as they grow older and experience their own romantic relationships. So this is just an example of how it can manifest later in life. All right, that is that PowerPoint. Any questions, comments?
This may be, I may be reducing this and minimizing this quite a bit, but for some reason that last like little simplified formula kind of filled in some gaps for me. Because I'm thinking of people in abusive relationships, and the simplified answer is, why don't you just get out? Like, you're being abused. Like, it sounds like a simple solution in my mind. And that's a bias that I have, but I never really thought about, there was one little box on that slide that said they learned that love equates to pain or hurt or something like that. And if you learn that at a young age, that that's what love is and that's what relationships are, then you don't know any different. And so it made a lot of sense to me, and I kind of I wouldn't say eliminated the bias, but like it made more sense to me, just kind of thinking more about family of origin and where they learned those things.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I want to make sure that, so thank you so much for sharing that, Miles. And I also want to say, not everyone who is in an abusive relationship had that family of origin experience. So it's like, oh, well, you didn't learn that, so why do you do it now? So then the possibility of that bias is still there of like, this isn't what you experienced, why are you doing this? So just, opening up to a lot of different possibilities as to why. And sometimes it's difficult to articulate that, but thank you for that. And hope, so because I'm a big proponent for exploring family of origin stuff and the recognition and acknowledgement that really does inform so many things that we do later in life. But it's not, you don't have to have adverse experiences in the past to have adverse experiences in the present. And this is a, correlation, not causation kind of thing. I want to highlight that as well. But good, I'm glad that made some connection for you and, expanded your possibilities as to, why an experience may be existing. Any other thoughts or questions or anything on last week's readings?
I was kind of curious about more of like the perpetrator's perspective and experience, because it seems like a lot of the power and control is like carefully designed, systematically designed. But a lot of times they wouldn't like see themselves as someone that's like seeking power and control. So I'm kind of wondering like how that comes to be, how it's like very carefully designed, yet also it's almost happening like on a subconscious or unconscious level for them.
Yeah, so you're wanting to like better understand the perpetrator and maybe some like factors influencing their current, like, can you form that in a question, Anna?
Yeah, how is it that the perpetrator's actions are so carefully plotted, yet they don't see that that's what they're doing? And I guess now that I'm saying it out loud, it kind of seems obvious, like maybe their family of origin was like that and they just kind of internalized those kind of processes.
Yeah, I mean, so again, there's no formula that fits everyone, right? And so one of the first thoughts that come to me is when you're in control and when you have power, you generally don't necessarily realize it. It's something that you realize more when you don't have it, when you don't have agency, when you don't have the ability to make a choice. That's when it's like, oh shit, power and control play a role in this. So if you are at an advantage, if it is benefiting you, you are less likely to be aware. And that's obviously not an excuse, but I say that as a potential reasoning of like, oh, I didn't realize that I had control over this situation because I had control the whole time, and you take for granted when you have choice, when you have influence. So I don't know if that helps, but also the awareness of that would probably not be a benefit to that person. So the more that I can push that away or not acknowledge that, the more that I can feel justified in what I'm doing or okay about what I'm doing.
Yeah, that was so helpful. That actually explains it very well.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments?
I think the chapter was also discussing how some of these systems are kind of assumed by the perpetrator, right? Like they just assume because there's a culture, right? And it's passed on. It's kind of preserved, right? Like the example that they made with pornographers and pimps, that there's a culture, there's already a language to kind of assume control. So the systems are already kind of at play. But I think what Anna was maybe referring to is like you said, like a more, someone who's not as aware, someone who's subconsciously doing it. But
Yeah, well, I would
that-
argue potentially if it's the culture, you're less aware of it. Like if it's just the norm, if it's what you know, we don't know that there's rules until we violate them, right? So like you may not know if you come, let's say you come from a family or a history where, you know, there are these very potentially like gendered dynamics and this dynamic, or maybe not even gendered, but like the power and no power dynamic is there. You don't know that it exists because you really don't necessarily, or you may be less aware that it exists because you don't know an alternative. So then potentially you would find that by going, yeah, my partner and I have equal say in everything, and we're like very, you know, equitable. And then that's where you would potentially get pushback from people going, why would you do that? That's not what we do here. That's not what we, so that's the notion of many of the systemic approaches of what we do is we purposely violate rules within a family or within a system to show that that's a rule, because the family just takes it for granted that it is what it is, because that's all I've ever known. And so I'm assuming that this is what other families do. I'm assuming that this is the norm because I've never known anything different.
And then you could use the model that you discussed with the microcosm and the macrocosms, right? As you pull away, like a dramatic example of that would, right now that's going on is like with the Taliban in Afghanistan. So it's, you would pull back to the macro part of it, right? Where it's the religion, where it's that system, it's the culture. So they don't have any doubt that this is the appropriate approach to dealing with, let's say, women, because that's like
Yeah.
a part
And
of
this,
rights.
yeah, so this is one thing that many of you identified within the triphasic model of like, perhaps there's some limitations in this from a systemic perspective. Maybe we like, there would be the opportunity, or if I were to use this, I would incorporate more of a macro lens, more of a socioecological lens to, because I think what it does is it puts people in context. And it also sometimes can normalize some of this. So I'm not wanting to like normalize trauma or normalize abuse, but particularly if you have a person coming to you thinking that they're to blame for something, or they're taking onus in something that's not theirs, that you can kind of pull out or zoom out to show more context of saying like, these are some messages that we get, and you've internalized some of this messaging. So yes, I mean, I'm always a proponent for zooming out and incorporating this like society and macro level and cultural influences in that to help somebody kind of better understand themselves. And that's why we talk about this in our field of if we focus solely on a micro level or solely on an individual level, we can miss a lot. So to your point, Danny, absolutely. Yeah, so Miles said, I doubt many cult leaders would call themselves part of a cult. They think they're bettering individuals. They think they're the good guys. And yeah, I mean, and they surround themselves with people who would validate that. Any other thoughts? All right, let's move to single session. So we go from talking about, you know, chronic trauma, prolonged trauma, to acute trauma, which is different from crisis. So remember, a crisis is when the experience that you have is bigger than or is more than the resources that you have access to, meaning that you're in this space of not having enough resources to cope with whatever's happening. And acute trauma is, well, I'll define it in just a second. So just so you know. Okay, so I'm gonna go essentially like, first I'll cover the chapter, then I'll cover the 2 articles that we read. So acute traumatic stress usually happens. So again, not always, but just under, giving you some foundation for a conceptualization is, so we take these interventions that we know for prolonged or chronic traumatic events or experiences, and we try to apply them to acute traumatic stress, and they may not work. So this is where things like single sessions come in that I'll talk about later in this PowerPoint. So acute traumatic stress happens within the first weeks or months following a traumatic exposure. So the use of debriefing, so it was mentioned, I think, in 2 of our readings, and as you probably gathered, there's pretty mixed views and applications of debriefing. So in terms of acute traumatic stress, debriefing has not been shown to be particularly helpful. So what the hope, I guess, or the creation of debriefing was like in a preventative nature for PTSD. So the thought is there's this acute traumatic experience, something like an earthquake, so it's something that it's out of your control. And then if we can debrief, if we can talk about it right away, then there's the potential of preventing any sort of prolonged experience or re-experiencing of the trauma. And so what has been found is that debriefing hasn't really shown to be that helpful. That doesn't mean that it's not helpful. I would just say that it may not be like your go-to for discussing or trying to intervene with a traumatic experience. So then there's the critical incident stress debriefing, which was later renamed to the critical incident stress management. So this is done in groups. So a group setting of 10 to 20 people, but there's also the opportunity to do this on an individual level. So these are relatively long sessions. So they can last anywhere from an hour to 3 hours. And so this is like so let's say that there's been a natural disaster or something that has happened that has affected several people. You would bring the individuals who have experienced the acute trauma into a setting within a week of that. Then so again, one of the things that can be not so helpful is the fact that these individuals, so again, it's brief. So some of you talked about in your Self with a Therapist papers how potentially some of these approaches that we use for trauma may not be feasible for individuals who may have to take time off work or may not have the resources to pay for months and months of sessions. So not only has managed care stepped in, so managed care meaning, that where we have to bill insurance and stuff like that. But our field is moving more and more into these brief approaches that can be, measured, and that, we don't need, this prolonged exposure and stuff like that. So these single sessions or, these groups where you're interacting with multiple people have been tested because we are pushing for more brief approaches. So in these settings, participants are asked to describe their experiences of their trauma, formulate a cognitive appraisal, an interpretation of the event, and then express their emotional reaction. So just think of this. So it's a group setting. It's potentially one or fewer than 5, let's say, sessions where the hope is by hearing other people's experiences that it's normalizing some of your own experience. One of the things that we have been learning about in this class is the importance of creating safety. So one of the things to consider if you were to do this is recognizing different group dynamics. So just like class, right? We have individuals who are very willing to participate, they're ready to participate, and we have others that just don't really participate as much. and that's generally how group dynamics go, right? You also have to recognize in these that some individuals are pretty ready to discuss the traumatic event, and others are nowhere near ready. And again, you might ask yourself, well, then why did they come into the group? Maybe they didn't, like expectations weren't expressed. So, or, people who are talking about their trauma in great detail, and that could be triggering to other people. There could be this felt sense of pressure of like, well, everybody else is sharing, so I guess I have to. That person may not be ready. So I share all of that just to, if you are in charge of groups like this or run groups like this, to potentially do some psychoeducation around sharing and like taking off the pressure from people to share, and just being aware of different people's processes. So group sharing in these settings are encouraged. And again, it's the intention of normalizing stress reactions and then providing the social support. So one of the things that we've been talking about is isolation, or feeling as though your trauma is unique and like no one will understand. The purpose of groups is to share that, you're not alone, that other people are here and have experienced that, potentially hopefully encouraging a felt sense of like community or connection to other people, so that you're not feeling so unique in your experience. And then at the end of these sessions, you discuss coping strategies and some psychoeducation regarding future consequences of the event. So one of the things to keep in mind with this is the recognition that psychoeducation, the purpose of it is to really like prepare and potentially and normalize different types of reactions, but not assuming that everyone will have those reactions. So as we know, responses to trauma can vary a lot. So the psychoeducation piece is just to say, this might happen, this might happen, this might happen, this might happen. And any one of these things is normal or could be expected. So it's not, the purpose isn't to say like, you will be experiencing this, or look at all the negative ramifications of what you've experienced, but to really prepare. So I say that because the interpretation from a client could be, oh my gosh, I'm not experiencing any of this. Was this actually trauma? Oh my gosh, so should I expect to experience all of these things? This is very scary. So just with psychoeducation, you should engage in a conversation around like reactions to the psychoeducation as well. So then there's the proximity, immediacy, and expectancy, and later simplicity intervention. So again, so for these acute traumas, and this has been used in military settings, and the goal is returning injured soldiers, goal of returning injured soldiers to the front lines of war. So proximity, immediacy, and expectancy emphasizes the need to intervene with injured survivors that were as close to the front line as possible. So looking at proximity, and as promptly as possible. So this is where you want to intervene soon, and with the expectation of recovery upon return to the military unit. So creating this expectancy. So some individuals who may be less traumatized or who have a more resilient underlying biology. So again, this is just like recognizing the biopsychosocial piece of trauma, or those who are otherwise at low risk. It may be true that immediate re-exposure does help with psychological recovery. So the thing to keep in mind here is doing some of this like re-exposure immediately can potentially re-traumatize. So there are assessments to be able to like take an educated guess at who may be a better fit for these immediate interventions and who may not quite be ready for immediate interventions. So those who lack sufficient affect regulation skills or have some kind of biological vulnerability to stress, this can be re-traumatizing and harmful. So a lot of what you'll be hearing in this class, and potentially a lot of what you'll be hearing in this field, is, you know, the classic "it depends," that, you know, we have a variety of interventions and we have a variety of approaches and theories and techniques because of how unique people can be. So this, what I want to always emphasize with you is that feedback piece of always checking in with your client, always checking in with the people that you're working with. How are you doing? How is this, the speed of this? How are you feeling on a scale of 1 to 10? Like talk to me about where your anxiety is. Talk to me about what's going on. How are you feeling inside your body? So again, that kind of grounding, that connecting to one's body. So always giving the client the opportunity to just assess and talk to you about where they're at, because that can help you gauge, like, you know, how much we're going to step on the gas, how much we're going to step on the brake in terms of what I'll talk to you about later in this PowerPoint about dosing. So then there's the technique of diffusing. So it's brief. So these are, again, things that you can employ. So if you have a client, or you're working with a population that has experienced some acute trauma, of giving that individual just some time to talk. So this is a conversational intervention. It's intended to provide support, reassurance, and information. So again, there's a psychoeducation piece. There is the validation piece, and then the, you know, human piece of providing support, where it just allows a person to discuss what has happened. And then it could lead into other conversation. So diffusing could be something where you implement this like at the beginning of a session. It could be something that you implement at the beginning of several sessions of, like, let's just talk, and then you can go into other things. But it's really meant to just, at no pressure, allow the person that you're speaking with to just express. So then there's the concept of psychological first aid. So the core concepts focus on giving practical assistance to immediate needs. So I'll be talking in a little bit about, you know, it's a little bit like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but that, you know, foundational stuff. So it's assistance with immediate needs, providing safety and comfort, and establishing connections with primary support networks and social resources. So psychological first aid does have modules, but it's pretty flexible. And then this technique, or this approach, also discourages trauma debriefing. So it doesn't ask for individuals to, like, all right, tell me what happened. So I think that piece of establishing safety and comfort can really go contrary to the technique of debriefing, because debriefing really is, all right, what happened, go. And potentially the assumption is, well, you're engaging with me, so you must want to talk about this, or you must feel safe, so go. And what we know is sometimes that can be incredibly re-traumatizing. Other times it can be really helpful. So if somebody just wants to, you know, share what happened to them, and the, you know, therapeutic alliance isn't as important. So again, that's just something to keep in mind. We lean into the idea of safety and connection and trust. And that's an assumption that we make of, that's an important thing to clients in order to share, but that's not necessarily everybody's experience. They may be just ready to talk and they want to get it off their chest, or, you know, or their relationship to you is not an important piece to them being able to share. So as clinicians, we're encouraged to allow individuals to talk about their experience as little or as much as they'd like. So again, debriefing is like talk, go. And this approach is take your time, share what you'd like, and you're never pushing for or expecting information or processing of the traumatic event. So just a little piece on cognitive behavioral therapy. It has had with acute trauma experiences mixed results. It also, so as we know, CBT is considered an evidence-based practice and evidence-based intervention. One of the things that there is not evidence on is the interpersonal trauma. So things like domestic violence, intimate partner violence. Cognitive behavioral therapy has not been tested on that. There's been very little research on it. So you can't generalize using cognitive behavioral therapy on somebody who comes to you with some interpersonal trauma. So as we work with clients, so when a client has they've experienced an acute trauma, assessment for readiness is a very important issue to keep in mind. And so the process of trauma requires even more attention to the appropriate focus, intensity, and pace of treatment. So again, acute trauma is something that happened a week ago, a couple months ago. So this person very well may still be kind of in the thick of even, understanding what's up and down. So really making sure that you're assessing for readiness. And one of the things that how we may like misread a client is if they appear relatively asymptomatic. So, so just giving you a chance to reflect on what is my vision of a person who has experienced trauma. Do I view them, or do I anticipate, because this is all important, do I anticipate this individual to be very emotive? Do I expect them to be inconsolable? Do I have this vision of what a person who has experienced trauma might look like? And that's a bias. But the important thing, especially in Self with a Therapist, in the spirit of Self with a Therapist, is just to be aware of that. What kind of biases, expectations, potential stereotypes do I have of an individual who has experienced trauma? Okay, so what you might do is, if this person isn't kind of like acting as expected, or they look as though they're relatively unaffected, this could potentially be dissociation, numbing, or like something going on internally that's not being expressed externally. So you might evaluate this individual and think, oh, like they're in control, because when you're working with acute trauma, one of the main goals is to help the person feel in control, because especially with something like an earthquake, some kind of natural disaster, we have no control over that. So you may feel incredibly triggered all the time, saying like, I don't have control over anything. How am I possibly going to gain some agency over what I'm experiencing? So with acute trauma, one of the goals is to empower an individual to feel like they do have control over their own process. So you might, they may appear in control and you go, all right, cool, they're fine, but they may not be coping well. So just, I say that of, being aware of any like expectations or visions that you might have of what a traumatized or a person who has experienced a traumatic event, what they would look like, how they would respond. And then if you're not seeing much of a emotional response, to be sure to assess for things like dissociation, numbing, or any sort of internal distress. Okay, so I said I labeled this dosing. So when we think of dosing, it's just basically like the frequency and intensity of our sessions. So if a person is experiencing high levels of dissociation, or sort of, this cognitive avoidance, this may signal some overwhelming distress or reduced affect regulation capacities. So again, if I'm like trying to avoid the emotional experience of this traumatic event, I may be experiencing something totally overwhelming. So I'm so overwhelmed at the possibility of processing this or looking at it or like leaning into it in any way, acknowledging it in any way. We have to be very aware of a person's response to this. So again, talking about acute trauma, that we may go too quick into this. And any sort of exposure or discussion of the traumatic event could be incredibly triggering for the individual and could be re-traumatizing. So just being very sensitive to and aware of a person's capacity, being very thoughtful and purposeful in your assessment. So just recognizing that there is like this window that we're working with an individual. And so assessment and feedback is important. So an approach to this could be talking about the trauma, if that makes sense. So it's like this kind of meta conversation around where you're not talking directly about it, but you're kind of assessing for readiness. What would it be like to discuss that? And just kind of gauging your clients, not only verbal feedback, but those nonverbals as well. Are they maybe fidgety? Do they shut down? Do they, put their head down? Do they look to the side? Do they become small? So just being very aware of any sort of nonverbals that may be coming back to you as you talk about the potential of talking about the trauma. So it's recommended that we let individuals talk who have experienced an acute trauma, talk as little about the trauma or as much as they do in the assessment process. So again, the assessment is where we're joining, this is a place where we are building that therapeutic alliance in, no judgment of any sort of response to any sort of trauma, encouraging talking, at the same time, letting them know we will go as quick or as slow. You will dictate the pace of what we do here in therapy. So as you're gathering information about the traumatic event, which with the assessment, you're allowing a client, because one of the things that I personally have experienced and I see as a supervisor of beginning therapists is it's like, oh, I have this assessment, we have to get through it. There's 35 questions. We have 50 minutes. Like if the client doesn't answer this, like we have to move on or something. So there's this pressure to complete assessments in some potentially arbitrary amount of time. I will say sometimes that this is dictated by your site, like where you're working, where they say you have 2 sessions to complete assessments. Like if that's the case, that may be something to talk to people about. But if you have the ability to pace on your own, I would encourage you to, you might start an assessment and get 1 question in, and you still have 34 questions for the next assessments. But what can happen is this desire to share a lot about an experience. One thing that I will also say is if a client, let's say in the first or second session, shares a bunch, there can be some, kind of guilt or shame around that. So just because somebody talks in one session does not mean that they will be willing to talk in subsequent sessions, because there may be kind of like a recoil of like, oh no, I shared too much. Now I have to, like whatever the emotions are around sharing, there can be a bit of a recoil. So just to be aware of that and quite frankly expect that. So what the goal is in this is to provide a balance of support, and then also in the assessment trying to elicit information in this non-threatening manner, because there is information that you'll need moving forward, but being as gentle and as non-pressure as possible in that. So when you are assessing, you want to assess for things like physical safety. So safety is always of the utmost importance. And making sure that you are connecting if a person is not physically safe, if they are suicidal, if they are homicidal, referring to appropriate resources. So this, like with suicidality, homicidality, that would be something where, you know, emergency services would come in, or there may be like a inpatient stay that needs to happen. So you're looking for things like psychosis, any sort of psychological debilitation, any sort of cognitive symptoms. And then you're also looking at any sources of support. So in the assessment, you're not just looking for things that are unhelpful or that are exacerbating or promoting or sustaining any sort of difficulties. You're also looking for protective factors. So things like social support. This trauma status is essentially like where they're at with it. Are they still in shock? Are they in denial? Are they at a place where they are willing to process? How like aware of their trauma are they? So it's all of these different pieces of where they're at with their trauma experience. So with the assessment, there is the potential for a referral. So you likely will be working in probably an outpatient capacity. I mean, you may work for inpatient, but many of us in the field as marriage and family therapists work in more of an outpatient capacity. So if there are signs of significant psychological, medical, or sociological difficulties, you will want to, the assessment will likely lead into you triaging or, you know, referring to appropriate resources. So this can be something like an inpatient stay. Again, it could be something like a shelter. So if this person is not physically safe, they could be like rehousing or working on moving this individual to another place. So with acute trauma, something to always keep in mind is that treatment might not always be necessary. So you may do this assessment and what you're realizing is this individual needs like basic needs met. So things like adequate shelter, clothing, food, these are things that you want to make sure, particularly after some sort of event like a flood, an earthquake, a fire, or other natural disasters, that it might not be that it was particularly traumatizing. I don't have a place to live. I want to know where I can access food because my home is gone. My city is underwater, something like that. So for individuals who have experienced rape or domestic violence, again, like I was just saying, it could be finding a place to stay that's safe away from the perpetrator. In some situations when physical needs or safety are paramount, psychological treatment is often not an immediate focus. So if you are looking, if you are finding that somebody needs psychological, basic needs met, like things like safety, shelter, for you to go, okay, yep, well, I'll acknowledge that those things are needed. Let's talk. So you're not meeting the client where they're at. So the goal is always safety and like basic needs for survival, meaning like food, water, shelter are met. So one thing that I think we do kind of lean into sometimes in our role as marriage and family therapists or just as clinicians is that our approach needs to be really clinical. So like casework or case management, that's not my role. My role is to provide a space for this person to process. And sometimes that's just really off the mark and you're not providing relevant care. So it's important that we're not too rigid in being attached to this clinical service, particularly with acutely traumatized individuals. So there are, again, I'm just going to highlight it. I'm saying it in a different way. There are times when the most important thing we can offer is basic human contact, emotional support, and connection with others. So we don't have to go into the processing. It can just be that we are providing just a eyes and ears, this human presence that can help connect the person to another human being or connect this individual to other resources. So inclusion for treatment, these are things like, so a person could be ready for treatment or included in treatment. Again, this isn't exhaustive. This isn't like cut and dry. That the assessment that you've taken has indicated no, oh, whoops. Oh, okay. Wait, I'm reading this backwards now. So the has indicated significant psychological impairment. So this would be exclusion from treatment. I'm sorry. Significant food, shelter, and medical issues are not present. No. So nope, I'm good. I just got very confused. So the assessment has indicated, I think that should read no significant psychological impairment. And then significant food, shelter, and medical issues are not present or under control. So again, the psychological needs or impairment is not there, because again, that would be a referral to some more inpatient, some potential medication. So just needing more immediate intensive support than we are able to offer in outpatient. So then significant food, shelter, and medical issues are not there. The client indicates a desire to receive treatment, and then clinical significant symptoms have persisted for at least 1 to 2 weeks. And then again, I'll highlight this again. This is not cut and dry. There can be more nuance to this. So my apologies on that first one. That really tripped me up. Okay. So then there is actually, it is 12:07. I'm going to go ahead and pause for just a second, give you guys a chance to take another break. And how about we come back together at 12:17. Come back together for the last 43 minutes of class. So thank you for being flexible with me. I know that I'm doing a ton of talking today. I promise to incorporate a better balance next week. I just really wanted to make sure that I'm delivering the content and going over the reading. So, but also like, feel free to give me some feedback on the format too. Okay, so let's hop back into the PowerPoint. So actually, let me minimize this a little bit. So one of the things that we read about was the self-trauma model. So I wanted to show you the link that I had. Sorry, I have like all of these things on my screen. I wanted to show you the link that I put in this slide, just to give you the opportunity to read a little bit more about the self-trauma model, but just highlighting the kind of like core components of this is to this approach focuses not only on the processing of post-traumatic stress, but also on the development or reinstatement of certain self capacities, things like identity, the ability to locate an internal sense of self from which to operate in the world, ideally one that is flexible as opposed to overly individualistic and unchanging. Affect regulation, the ability to tolerate and ultimately reduce painful internal states without resorting to avoidance strategies, and relatedness, the capacity to form meaningful, nurturing relationships with others. So these are the three kind of like underlying cornerstones of this approach, but this article discusses kind of like 10 questions about the self-trauma model. So I just wanted to, I don't want to go too much into it because it was just like kind of really touched on in the reading. But if you're interested in learning more, this is an article for you to be able to refer to and read a little bit more about. Okay, so special considerations working with trauma. So I'm going to go essentially heading by heading in the book. So you want to have a balanced emotional support and compassion. So with an acutely traumatized individual, so the first moments of interaction should be and can be directed toward making empathic contact and communicating care. So in this, the goal should be to respond in a manner that communicates an appreciation for the client's traumatic situation. And also this an appreciation of the difficulty in talking to you about this. And you're providing this emotional acceptance and warmth, and you're also maintaining professional in this non-invasive stance. And I'll be very honest with you, that's going to be a balance that you'll continue to work on, is, professionalism. And because I think that we all have this like vision of what professionalism is. And I'm professional if I'm able to leave all of my feelings at work, leave all the issues of my clients at work. And that's not always possible. So I really want to challenge your potential thoughts on professionalism of looking a certain way and acting a certain way. And I think the more you can integrate yourself and your professional identity, you'll be able to simultaneously take up that space. So the professionalism is really like affect regulation, kind of towing that line of being a friend. So you are providing something that is different from, a stranger at a bus stop, where you're not really reacting so much to the things that are being shared with you. You're normalizing that in your body language. You are being empathic. So the idea of professionalism really is the ability to hold space in a way that like untrained people probably have a more difficulty doing when they're met with like an acute trauma narrative. So this active relatedness. So something with acute trauma requires you to provide sometimes concrete advice, make direct referrals, and act as this strong relational figure, which I think sometimes kind of like flies in the face of this postmodern approach that many of us take, of this very collaborative, non-directive, client-led. But sometimes what the client needs from you is to like, what do I do? Where do I find this resource? How do I get this thing I need? And so you may be a person that the client actively relies on for a period of time. And sometimes that's like pretty difficult for us. And like, we don't want our client to be dependent. We don't want them to become too reliant on us. I think there is that you need to acknowledge with these acute traumatic experiences, when the client like meets with you pretty soon after, it may be like this case where you need to be more directive, you need to be more active in that, and just recognize that that's something that person very well may need at this point. And then what you'll do when you work with a person is to expand their social network, is to work with saying like, what's existing in your network now where you can kind of like turn your attention to another person, or where you can do some of these things on your own or for yourself, but just not being afraid of somebody becoming like, or being for a very short period of time, kind of looking to you for some direction and referrals. So again, this is a shorter term response to the disorganizing and destabilizing effects of an acute trauma. So just being very aware of like, equilibrium, gone, don't know up and down. I'm looking to you as a professional to just like give me some level of stability, some organization. Along with that, we talk a lot in our field about boundaries and about these professional boundaries. Likely you have supervisors that say, I never give my cell phone out to clients. I do not return calls outside of office hours, like, for business hours, 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. or whatever it is. These boundaries are incredibly important for me to keep. And you are welcome to do that. That is not the approach of everybody. So you're going to find what works for you. I will say personally, I do give my clients my cell phone number. And this is probably some self with a therapist stuff. But also I recognize that sometimes clients are in crisis and they may not have the social support. It's very rarely been used by my clients. So I tell you that to say you have options here, particularly with acute trauma, is that you may need to be more available. Like potentially on a like 24-hour basis. So, and so many of you may be familiar with like, you know, crisis lines or organizations that work with, you know, acute trauma or individuals in crisis, where their protocols are just different than like private practice or community mental health or something like that. So with acute traumatic situations, the client may experience these crises or these intermittent experiences of being completely overwhelmed with distress or grief, and they may need some more frequent contact. So, you know, depending upon where you're at, you know, with outpatient, we tend to do, you know, weekly 50-minute sessions. This may be something where you're seeing this individual on like a, you know, bi-weekly basis, every other day, every day for a period of time. So this is just something that you would work out with your client, making sure that they have, you know, so if they're using insurance, if this is something that insurance will cover, like figuring out all of their resources and their like contextual facts about them. So what we may need to do when a person is in this space is being available for them where you are seeing them on a more frequent basis, and potentially providing them your personal number, but also all of these other resources for them. So numbers for emergency rooms, for crisis centers. And again, you could potentially be on call or have other backup clinicians for them. So you, and providing something or like opening up your schedule to have like space for impromptu sessions where, you know, you're not scheduling yourself back to back to back to back with clients, but maybe you have like an hour, an open hour where if you have a client that you know that's in crisis or has come to you with an acute trauma, just like offering that space. So another thing, I alluded to this earlier about casework. So sometimes we get a little rigid in our professional identity of like, I'm a couple and family therapist. I am only here to do the clinical work. I do processing, like we do this, you know, talk therapy. I would argue that our role is bigger than that. I will say that I feel like social workers do a pretty good job with this, and we're like akin to social workers. You should have in your repertoire some case management in terms of recognizing that sometimes what a person needs is, like we've been talking about, these basic human needs. You should, so what I say this because in whatever community you work in, you should know where shelters are. You should know where food banks are. You should know, you should have connections to affordable housing, connections to other sort of resources that you should have, like a connection to a like medical facilities that work on sliding fee scales, that don't work necessarily on insurance. So just have, or who do, so you can make these quick referrals and you have this community connection. I would also encourage you to like get out into your community wherever you end up working and be known to the community, so that, you know, when when Dr. Lappin refers somebody, like there's kind of some weight or like urgency behind the name because I've made those connections, so that maybe you set up your client to be able to get resources like as quickly as possible. So again, economic assistance, insurance personnel, legal issues. So having these connections within the community, I very deeply believe that this casework piece of what we do is so important, and we don't have to be doing talk therapy to be providing something therapeutic and something really meaningful to our clients. So social connection, this is either perceived or actual disconnection. So, you know, thinking again from natural disasters where maybe they have lost contact with family members. They do not know where their family members are, and or they could be feeling some level of disconnection where it's, you know, the people are there, they have physical contact with them, but they're just feeling disconnected. You know, something has changed. I'm not connecting with people in the way I was before. So an intervention for this often includes reconnecting these individuals with relational resources. So helping them locate and establish contact with family members, or this is like larger community, connecting them with their faith community, facilitating access to community resources in some groups. So again, very important to be connected in your community in that way. Know what kind of support groups are available. If there's gaps in support groups, maybe it's something that you can provide. If you're noticing many of your clients are struggling with a specific kind of presenting issue, and you think that the community could benefit from having a group like this, start one. And so that's a good way to become connected with the community and be known within the community. So in many cases, increasing social support and mobilizing community resources are more of an immediate benefit than going into these, psychological interventions. So again, those basic needs, safety, very important. So with psychoeducation, I alluded to this earlier. So this is, you can provide psychoeducation on the importance of self-care. So with acute trauma, particularly ones where the individual feels completely out of control, is like something that they can have some agency over is their self-care. So just something you can educate them on the importance of that, brainstorm ideas with the individual, check to see what's relevant, what's feasible. So anytime you're providing any sort of intervention or homework, you always want to check for feasibility, relevance, things like that, because something that may work for you. So let's say you're like, you know what, I meditate, works great for me. And maybe being in a meditative state for a person, your client, could be really triggering in that whenever they like close their eyes or try to meditate, they're having flashbacks or something like that. So just really making sure that you're talking through any sort of suggestion that you may give or any sort of brainstorming. So with psychoeducation, you want to talk to the individual about the importance of okay, so again, timing is very important with all of this, but like potentially some of the consequences of excessive avoidance. So this is something, again, as you are creating that therapeutic alliance, as you are creating safety and validating and being very empathic, that you are also peppering in there some reality about some of the coping mechanisms. So with the psychoeducation, one of the beautiful things about psychoeducation is you don't have to like target it, like you don't have to focus on the individual. So they don't feel like attacked of like, as you are excessively avoiding or something like that, but talking about some of these like very common responses to trauma. So one of the things that many of my clients, so I'm scripting to you, one thing that like we've learned in literature or something that many of my clients experience is coping through avoidance. And here is what we know about avoidance. So it's not saying like, I see you doing this. It's just this general education about a very common coping skill that people use, and you're just giving some information about it. So it doesn't have to be, like I said, focused on the client. You're going to want to also discourage them from any sort of excessive substance use after the trauma, because again, this is another opportunity to avoid. It's again it makes sense, right? I don't want to sit in my head and re-experience. I want to do whatever I can to get away from this thing, and substances are pretty dependable. Like I can depend on this substance to provide me, even if it's for a moment, some kind of escape from this. And I would rather live there than to be like in my own like sober thoughts about this. So if they are, so when the individual is participating in avoidance, sorry, it's like the gears of my brain just stopped. It's again very understandable, but what it can do is it can interfere with recovery. And one of the things that we provide with trauma survivors is exposure, activation, and processing. So another part of psychoeducation, so for those of you who are going through like the TFCBT and the CPT trainings, which I hope you are, because you want to give yourself enough time to like reflect on it and get through it, is the idea of in vivo experiences. So in vivo experiences are really that of exposure, and they happen largely outside of the therapeutic setting. So these are things like homework, where you will prep for them, you'll talk through them, but really in vivo is about kind of like this hierarchy of exposure of, let's say for like, so in the TFCBT training, the situation was where the child was abused by, I think, a stepdad in the basement bathroom. So the therapist worked with the child to kind of figure out this hierarchy of exposure. So what would be the scariest thing? It's like going into the bathroom by myself. Okay, so that's kind of, so with in vivo, what you're trying to do is take this, really it's a unharmful, because it's, you know, there's this space. So this child, for example, has equated this bathroom with this experience, right? The bathroom is inherently not scary, like meaning, or not scary, it's not unsafe. So being in the bathroom isn't going to cause the child any physical harm. So he's not in danger when he's in that space. But what in vivo in exposure does is tries to take this like non-threatening kind of stimuli and make it neutral. So the goal ultimately with this child would be to get him to be able to, without being activated and triggered, go into the basement bathroom and be able to use it as a bathroom. So that what they did was they put together a plan with his mom. So with an adult, it would be like a trusted other, where you would be able to kind of like scaffold up to this traumatic space and have control over it so that you're not emotionally activated. So some things you can do in therapy is like, so you could, with this example, like look at pictures of bathrooms, so you could like expose to imagery that is distanced enough from it, and then figure out kind of where the activation starts. Because maybe a picture of a bathroom is not threatening, there's no activation. So you're kind of trying to figure out where the baseline is on that, and then work your way up to something so that you can take away really like the power of that space or whatever it is that's triggering to the individual. So some more psychoeducation. I talked about this a little earlier, of not everyone experiences this like full range of trauma responses. So this gentle, non-alarming education can serve to validate and normalize what has happened. So again, for me, one of the things that I tend to use is literature, is other clients. So it may be that it's something that you personally have experienced. You have the option of sharing that if you want. So again, remember part of that creating safety, that therapeutic alliance, is peppering in some self-disclosure. But sometimes if you're like nervous about sharing personally, put it on a client. I've had clients who, so let's say you've experienced the thing. Instead of saying, I have experienced it, you can say, I've had clients who have experienced this, and like, this is what they've shared with me. It's not lying. It's just a way to normalize what has happened for the client and let them know that they're not alone. But like I was saying, sorry, I'm going to go back to the not everyone experiences a full range of trauma responses, is that this can, just being aware that clients may have differing responses to that. So when you're providing psychoeducation about the trauma responses, putting in there that not everyone experiences all of these things, and that like, because they may feel some like shame around not experiencing something. So just really normalizing that you don't have to experience all of this. People experience things very differently, and then give them, again, this dialogue, this chance to respond to some of the psychoeducation that you're providing them. So acutely traumatized clients may benefit from information on how to identify potentially triggering situations. and stimuli. So it could be, people, places, things, so that they can avoid excessive activation when it is problematic. So this is, like with TFCBT, for example, the in vivo experience is weeks into the module. So we're not asking clients right off the bat to be like, what are your triggering stimuli? Let's expose you to them so that you're not as activated. But it is important at the beginning to know that and acknowledge that, so that you can potentially help the client until they're less emotionally activated or have less of like a stress activation or stress experience, to potentially stay away from some of those things. Because there are some things that can be very beneficial for the client to avoid, so that they're not excessively activated and potentially re-traumatized. So there is a balancing of that. Okay. And ultimately, all this psychoeducation is to help the client feel more of a sense of control over their situation and reduce flashbacks and this emotional flooding. Because when you have this excessive activation or this very overwhelming activation, the sense of helplessness can come in. And what you're trying to do is like empower with some knowledge and information while also processing. So the therapeutic window, I alluded to this earlier. So the most common error that we make as clinicians is that we begin treatment too early. So again, we provide too much memory exposure, too much activation. We're not taking into account that safety. I know I've said this a bunch of times, but there's like one thing in these first weeks that I really want to take away, for you to take away, is patience in this. So again, if you have a vision of a person, what a person looks like if they have experienced an acute trauma, and the person sitting across from you doesn't look like that, like, don't make assumptions about their, where they are in their processing of the traumatic experience. So the therapeutic window may initially be small. The clinician, you must approach trauma processing carefully and only attempt any sort of exposure activities when it is clear the client has sufficient internal stability. So again, this is where those scaling questions come in. This is where you're doing it, maybe informal assessments throughout your sessions, where you are giving them a formal assessment at the beginning of sessions while they're in the waiting room or something like that. So you're just gauging their internal stability. Maybe you give them a little bit of exposure, see how they respond to that, give them a chance to give you feedback. How are you feeling? So a lot of this stuff is that kind of like visceral response where you're getting them reconnected potentially with their internal processes. And so what you're going to be asking yourself is, how soon and how intense can I make this? These are going to be like your default baseline questions in terms of the therapeutic window. The best approach to assess for emotional stability is to provide like kind of dosed exposure. That's what titrated means. Only when it's indicated, only when the client is ready, and with careful attention to this window. So again, how soon, how intense? So those are the questions we're going to be asking ourselves and the client while getting feedback from the client. So duration of treatment. So one of the messages that potentially you could get from trauma work is that it takes time. And that's absolutely true in some cases. In some cases, it's not. So again, particularly focusing on acutely traumatized individuals, they don't require extended treatment. Sometimes this acute trauma can resolve on its own, just take some time, some separation from the experience. Chronic post-traumatic stress is associated. So these are things that you would assess for: inadequate affect regulation, excessive avoidance. So these are things that you're going to be assessing for. So with chronic stress, these, when you're assessing for inadequate affect regulation and excessive avoidance, these also may be things that aren't applicable to somebody who is coming to you with an acute trauma experience. So it's possible, although not yet entirely proven, that early successful intervention catches post-traumatic symptoms. So it's, again, it's theorized. It has happened, but it's not fully generalizable, that if you attend to acute traumas, there is the potential of preventing post-traumatic stress disorder. But it's not the case. So anyway, or it's not always the case. But the point of this is that less comprehensive interventions can potentially be helpful. So at the same time, I want to emphasize, and the text emphasized to you, that not all acute trauma survivors respond to short-term treatment. So it may be that, people who have experienced an acute trauma don't really need therapy, don't really need any intervention. And it could also be true that people who have experienced an acute trauma need quite long, prolonged therapy. So again, potentially frustrating. The message is, it depends. It depends on the individual. So that's why you're going to be participating in assessment and feedback from the client. Okay. So now moving on to the assessment, crisis intervention, and trauma treatment, the integrative ACT intervention model. So going to try to get as far with this as we can. So acute traumatic stress management has 3 steps. You're going to assess for danger and safety for the person and others. Consider the type and extent of any sort of property damage or physical injury that was sustained, and evaluate the level of responsiveness. Is this person alert? Are they in pain? Are they aware of what has occurred? Are they in any sort of emotional shock or under the influence of any sort of substances? So when you're assessing for spatial dimensions. So how close were they to the event? Like physically, how close were they? Subjective time, like what is their understanding of the timeline of the event? And is this something that they believe can occur again? Because that could really influence how they are responding to it. If they're living in this constant belief that this is something that will recur, that's going to be different than somebody's response of like this being a kind of a one-off. And then I just took a screenshot of what was in the text about like what ACT stands for. So this is the assessment of immediate needs. So the theme of today really is making sure that the person is safe and has their needs met, basic needs met. And then there's different types of assessment: triage, crisis, trauma, and the biopsychosocial and cultural assessments, which I'll get to in later slides. And then the C is connecting with support groups and any sort of crisis intervention. So I'll go over Robert's 7-stage model, and then the traumatic stress reactions with the T, and I'll also go over the 10-step acute trauma and stress management protocol. So again, these are just assessments for you to have in your toolbox. So the first step in the ACT approach in terms of assessment is psychosocial needs. And what may happen is that you delay this assessment until you make sure that they're stabilized and have like whatever supports that they need. So these are going to be the areas that you will look at in the assessment. You can read that. So anything from the perception of the magnitude of the event to any sort of suicide or homicide risk. So in this assessment piece of ACT, the goal is to provide a systematic method of organizing the client information related to any personal characteristics, parameters of the crisis episode, and the intensity and duration of the crisis, and utilizing this data to develop a treatment plan. Ultimately, all pieces of what you're gathering in terms of information about the client, you are going to you're using this to make sure that everything that you create in your treatment plan is catered to that individual. So this is like the risk in having pre-made treatment plans. So I personally am not a big supporter of having like, oh, you've come to me with a acute traumatic event. Boom, here's the treatment plan that I'm going to use with all of my clients. So you're making sure that you're taking the assessment is always to inform a relevant, feasible, culturally concordant treatment plan for your client. So I really want to caution you against like a one treatment plan fits all for this presenting issue approach. So the biopsychosocial and cultural assessments, these are some things that you can do to assess this. So you can assess through monitoring and observing. You can have the client provide like a client log could be like attendance, or it could be something like it's a journal. You could do things like semi-structured interviews. Again, these individualized rating scales, recognizing that sometimes they're not fully inclusive. So this would be the opportunity to get multiple like formal assessments if that works for you. So again, all of this is to gather appropriate intervention to make a relevant treatment plan that is an accurate conceptualization of the situation from the client's perspective. So all of these things that you are gathering is going to be from the voice and perspective of your client, so that you don't have to guess. You don't have to make assumptions. The person that can provide you that information is sitting right across from you. So just going over Robert's 7-stage crisis intervention model. Again, acute trauma moving into some crisis intervention. So stage 1 is making sure that you're understanding the lethality of the crisis. So first and foremost, you're just making sure that the person is okay and safe. So you might be like, well, Sarah, established rapport, isn't that something that we always talk about in stage 2 or in stage 1 as like the first thing? You really want to make sure that the individual is safe and like free from the possibility of dying. So then you want to establish that first and then build rapport in this crisis intervention model. So these stages, as you can, I'll let you read those, but this is a guide, not necessarily a rigid process. So this is, again, with crisis intervention, you want to be active, potentially be very directive, focused, and create hope. So you are evoking being hopeful, and so you're modeling that for your client. So when a person is in crisis, you may be more directive than kind of like your natural approach, or like a more intuitive approach to therapy, because this person, again, has the potential of coming to you with like very dysregulated, quite disorganized, and needing some stabilization, and you can provide that through direction. Okay, so I wanted to also show you this 7 stages that's written out like this, but I took a screenshot of it from the text. So just recognizing that you are, as you can see, very similar to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where like crisis resolution comes really toward the end. So here you're just making sure that you're assessing and creating or you're understanding the client in their context, making sure that they're safe. Then you're establishing some rapport, you're identifying the dimensions of the problem, and then you're, processing some or exploring feelings. So just knowing that you're doing this assessment, and then it's kind of this like staged approach before you even come up with, or before you come to this place of crisis resolution. So I share this with you so that the expectation isn't that, you're expecting the crisis to be resolved soon in the process. And then another thing that we talked about earlier was this 10 stages of acute stress management. So just so you know how to read this, it starts here at assess for danger, goes over to the left next row, because I know I didn't put numbers on this, so my apologies for potentially making this a little bit confusing. But again, you are able to read that. You can see first making sure that safety is established, any sort of understanding the physical or perceptual mechanism of the injury, their level of responsiveness and to the event, how they're, conceptualizing it, any sort of medical needs that are there, you want to make, because we can't provide any sort of care for medical needs. That's a referral that needs to happen. And then understanding each individual's signs of traumatic stress. So again, this is something that you may say, I don't understand why at the 5th step, or at the 6th step is when you're introducing yourself and your title and stuff. So again, this is, just an approach. So you may want to introduce yourself immediately. And so if somebody is, waking up out of a daze or something, saying, this is me, this is who I am, and trying to develop a connection there with this model, it is not until the 6th stage that happens. And that's, again, can be amended if it feels more appropriate to you. And then ultimately you want to bring the person to the present and help them to describe future events and provide referrals. So this is, again, when somebody is in acute stress, when they are in some kind of crisis. And then last but not least, plug in through these, that single session behavioral treatment article that we read about earthquake related post-traumatic stress disorder. And this is essentially where they took this single session treatment and tested it against a waiting list. So I just wanted to go over really quick some of the rationale for these single sessions. So again, talking about managed care, talking about the importance of, making sure that we are attending to and acknowledging how impactful things like natural disasters, war, mass terrorism, political violence, we're becoming more aware of them. So this has created a push for us as mental health providers to provide brief psychological treatments. So again, it's making this as accessible as possible, and recognizing that not everybody has the ability to participate in therapy long-term. So I didn't go through all the methodology and stuff like that. I just wanted to highlight a couple of things from the discussion. So the stories of the improved survivors in the waitlist group, a detailed assessment may help survivors gain awareness of their problem as symptoms and enhance their sense of control over them. So this process sometimes leads to self-instigated exposure, which might further enhance self-control and ultimately reduce. So basically what this is saying is people in the wait list also improved. So what might happen is that individuals may provide themselves or initiate some exposure to traumatic stimuli. So this is in an attempt to gain some control over their responses to it, gain some control over the situation. So just saying that the wait list also had some improvements. So there could be the clinical implication is recognizing that some people may instigate some exposure on their own, and just being aware of that and having a conversation about that. So several lines of evidence also suggest that the effects of a single session intervention designed to enhance. So again, the purpose of this is in having some more control over your responses of the situation. So basically what was found in many of these studies is that a single session can be helpful, and it's been replicated across studies. So again, just recognizing that sometimes people need lots of intervention for quite a bit of time, and some people really just benefit quite greatly from a single session that is aimed at improving and increasing control. So again, the uncontrollable and unpredictable nature of things like earthquakes they can lead to pervasive conditioned fear, extensive avoidance, and ultimately feelings of helplessness among survivors. So again, the theme of increasing control, decreasing avoidance, if you have increased control and the perception of control, that's pre-correlated to feelings of hopelessness and decreased feelings of helplessness. So a sense of control and a discourse designed to instill courage. Okay, so sorry. With its emphasis on a sense of control and a discourse designed to instill courage, modified behavioral therapy offers an effective strategy to overcome fear and therefore reverse the process leading to helplessness. So again, just a different way of saying if you increase control and sense of control, it can decrease the feelings of helplessness. Another thing, so again, this is kind of pulling from narrative in that the technique of externalization. So if you're looking at fear as something that can be controlled, so if the experience is internalized, there's a lot more difficulty in any sort of intervention of like, how do I change myself or something that's inherent to me? But if you are looking at your response of fear as something that can be controlled, or again, like this is using like fought, defeated, like whatever language makes most sense to your client. Again, this can help in decreasing the sense of helplessness and also convey some hope and courage. So really with these single sessions, it's mostly about increasing a sense of control and the desire to confront any sort of fear response that you are having to the stimuli. Whew. Okay, lots of talking. I know we're about a minute over time, but I do want to just offer anything in terms of like questions, clarity on anything. Thank you for listening to me for basically 3 hours. But we're all caught up.
I just wanted to comment, you were mentioning a few slides ago, how it may seem kind of weird based on Lerner and Sheldon's 10 stages, how like introducing yourself isn't until like the 6th stage. And it may sound weird on the surface, but I experienced a client coming in during crisis last week, and I wish I had done my reading beforehand.
That's okay.
Because I feel like I could have really benefited from this a week ago. But she was in crisis. She experienced an anxiety attack, and we had been sitting together for about 30 minutes before I kind of thought to myself, like, she doesn't even know my name. Like, I haven't even like introduced myself. Like, she was in tears, and I just invited her in. She sat down, we talked, we did deep breathing exercises. I got her to calm down just a little bit. And then I realized, like, she doesn't even know my name. Like, it was just, it happened kind of naturally, but I kind of wanted to normalize that. Like, yeah, you can introduce yourself first, but sometimes the crisis is far more important than knowing each other's names.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. The reason I pointed it out is like just so much of what we're talking about is that importance of establishing that rapport. And so it may seem counterintuitive to not lead with that. But thank you so much for that, Miles. Like, this was something where the introduction of yourself may be more self-serving and very unimportant to the client who just really wants to get it out there. All right. Well, thank you so much for listening to me so much this week. Yes, next week we will cover, or I will create more space for you to engage with one another. So thank you for listening, and I will see you next week.